Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips and I am the Associate Dean of the University Honors College. I'm pleased to welcome you to this honor series focusing on citizenship, immigrants, and refugees. At this time, I will invite our Dean, Dr. John Weil, to come to the front and introduce our speaker.
It's a pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Andrei Korobkov, who will be speaking today on migration patterns in the former Soviet Union. Although most of the lectures in this series have focused on immigration to the United States, this is only a small part of the worldwide phenomenon. You may recall that one of our speakers mentioned that there are more refugees today than at any time since World War II. Although they have not all necessarily been refugees displaced by war, there are many other individuals who have sought to migrate because of political, economic, and ethnic changes in their home countries. For many years, Dr. Korobkov, who has PhDs both from the Russian Academy of Sciences and from the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa, has been making presentations at scholarly conferences throughout the world, writing scholarly articles, and otherwise contributing to scholarly debate on the subject. I'm especially pleased to introduce Dr. Korobkov because he is a member of the MTSU Department of Political Science and International Relations and was hired on my watch back in 2000. Let's give Dr. Korobkov an Honors College welcome.
Thank you, John. I have been dealing with migration for a very long time, and I cover various aspects of migration, including, migration to and from Russia, comparative migration within BRICS, in Western Europe, in North America. I also deal with brain drain, and in this capacity I serve also as an illustration to you of the general topic you discuss in this course, because I have been a migrant and I am one of those brains that have drained. I will start with talking about Russia, but then I will talk about general issues of migration and look at Western European and American current migration situation as well. If we talk about migration in general, the International Organization for Migration last year has cited 244 million migrants, of whom 29% were located in global north and about 70+% in the global south. It immediately shows us first the scale of migration and also the fact that all regions of the world are affected, and more than that. However tough is the situation right now is, for example, in Western Europe, in reality migration situation in the global south is worse. And there are issues of cultural distance of migrants from the local population, the socioeconomic impact of migration, legal status of migrants, and many others. A couple of technical terms that we have to deal with before we start our discussion. Very frequently in American political discourse right now and worldwide, used is the term illegal migration, illegal migrants. This term is technically incorrect because illegal presumes that people cross the border in violation of the existing law with the goal of engaging in illegal activities. Thus, within migration field of studies used are terms unlawful, irregular, unconventional, and a number of other terms, but not the term illegal. I will still use illegal because that's what you're probably used to, but in general, keep in mind that this term is not adequate. In general, in order to become illegal in conventional white term, a migrant has to violate one of three preconditions. First, cross the border illegally. Second, stay in violation of the existing status, whether they crossed initially border legally or illegally. And third, get employment in violation of their visa status and general status as well. If you think carefully about those 3 points, well, they immediately tell us that very frequently people become illegal, not because they want to, but because either the state forces them into this gray zone, well, or they encounter, well, illegal de facto practices of local officials or, well, local businessmen for whom it would be much more profitable to hire people who are illegal for, well, various reasons. We'll return to this issue, but, well, first of all, let's look at the Russian situation. Thanks to Hillary Clinton, you now know that Russia is as evil as it was, well, in the times of the Cold War. So I wouldn't tell you about this period and about the way, well, Russia was depicted. But basically, the Soviet Union was an extremely isolated country that did not allow any free migration, well, outside the country. And to a large extent, migration that was taking place within the country was controlled by the state. And migration was going intensively, but it was practically exclusively migration of Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic elites from the Russian center to the ethnic periphery of the country. And it has created, well, very mixed populations. For example, in Kazakhstan, right now the 7th largest country of the world, that became known to Americans thanks to the movie Borat. And by the way, it's the 7th largest country of the world, as I just mentioned. Well, the share of ethnic Kazakhs at the end of the Soviet period was 39%. Well, 61 were people of other nationalities, some of them very exotic, Koreans, Japanese, Spaniards, Poles, and others who were sent to that region into exile by Stalin. So the population was highly mixed. And when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, there emerged a fear on the part of, well, non-titular groups of ethnic groups of the, well, former Soviet republics to go back to their, so to speak, ethnic states, even while many of them never lived or even visited those ethnic states. And therefore, the first wave of migration that took place approximately in the period 1991 to 1995 was ethnic, was permanent, and was politically motivated. So Armenians were moving to Armenia, Russians to Russia, Ukrainians to Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And it was a pretty large wave. Well, the Soviet population at the end of the USSR existence was 289 million. And of them, 54 million were people who lived outside their ethnic republics. And that's about a half of these people, about 25 million, have moved to their ethnic states. But with economic and political stabilization, with the formation of new elites in the newly formed countries, well, this wave came essentially to a standstill, and there started another wave of migration. People from all former Soviet republics started to move to Russia, seeking economic opportunities, and this was primarily temporary labor and increasingly illegal in terms of status migration. At present, living in Russia are 12.3 million people, so it is roughly 8% of the population, who are technically immigrants. They were not born in that country. Most of them have come from other former Soviet republics. These are people who have moved to live in Russia. But besides that, they started to develop a large-scale, economically based migration. Working in Russia, depending on the season, are between 3.5 and 7 million labor migrants, of whom about 6 million are from the former Soviet states, and about 1 million are people coming from outside that region. Increasingly, these are the Chinese, even though representatives of other nationalities are also visible. And as in the United States case, there is an issue of illegal migration, again, depending on the season, depending on methodology, depending on political preferences of a particular researcher. This, their number is estimated at between 3 and 5 million people. If you look in relative terms, this share is even higher than in the United States. Well, in the same fashion as in the US or in Western Europe right now, migration causes a lot of political disagreements, a lot of emotions, and populist leaders demand the deportation of illegals, the introduction of high barriers. At the same time, it is absolutely obvious to economists, for example, that Russian economy cannot function without the inflow of labor migrants and permanent migrants to the Russian territory. In contrast to the US, Russian population is declining. It was 148 million when the USSR has fallen apart. Right now it's 146 million. And without, again, the influx of migrants, it will keep declining very quickly. And just as an illustration to you, living in the Asian part of Russia, and this is about 1.5 of US territories, are 29 million people. These people are facing 200 million Chinese living in the northern provinces of China. This causes a lot of apprehension on the part of Russian elites and, population in general. Nevertheless, and this is very interesting, in contrast to Europe and the United States, there did not emerge strong populist leaders leading openly anti-immigrant movements. There are two reasons for that, and they are kind of paradoxical. First, the general weakness of civil society, not allowing the aggregation of interest and formation of such wide movements. Second, the fact that the state, with its policies that are discriminatory towards migrants, kind of has filled in this space, not allowing the emergence of such strong leaders. But, we'll see how it will develop. There are two major issues within migration sphere that serve as irritants to both population and politicians. One of them is the influx of people from Islamic states, first of all, former Soviet republics. And another one, as I have already mentioned, it's an issue of Chinese immigration. The Central Asian Muslim immigration is a very serious, real issue. The Chinese immigration is much smaller. The number of Chinese in the Russian territory is estimated at between 200 and 600 people. But if you read populist newspapers, they say that it's at least 10 million and give even larger figures. So the problems for Russia are primarily related to two issues. First, it has encountered the phenomenon of immigration much later than any of Western countries. And second, in contrast to many, but not all, Russia serves all three possible functions within the international migration chain. These are immigration, emigration, so movement into the country, out of the country, and serving as a kind of jumping pad. So people come to a country in order not to stay, but move on, in Russia's case, from Asia to Western Europe. They cannot move there. They get stuck in the territory of this transit country. And this group usually is a huge problem, both socioeconomically and, in terms of, moral treatment of this issue in general. So if Russia has all these problems. And by the way, Russia, on the other hand, say compared to the US, it has coexisted with the Islamic states on its borders since its inception as a state. And there is even a legend that, when the Grand Duke of Russia, Prince Vladimir, who has the same name as Putin, that in translation, by the way, means the ruler of the world, he was choosing a monotheistic religion. And he had at that time 4 options. So Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Islam, and Judaism. And he invited 4 clerics and talked to them. So first he listened to the rabbi and said, no way. What kind of God do you have if he has allowed you to be dispersed all over the world? So it wouldn't work. Then he invited a Catholic, and again he was appalled. The most insulting to him was the idea of celibacy. Vladimir was not a very ascetic man. He had about 150 wives, so he rejected Catholicism too. Then he invited a mullah, and of course he said, no way, I'll get drowned the same night. Well, the very idea that you can prohibit drinking was kind of appalling to a Russian ruler. And finally, he accepted Orthodoxy. The real reason, of course, was geopolitical, the closeness and importance of that time of Byzantium, and the weakness of Judaic states, even though there was a Judaic state on the border of Russia, Hazara Khaganate, being remote from the major Catholic centers. But anyway, it just reminds us that Russia had a love-hate relationship with Islam, and while fighting Islamic states all the time, it was also familiar with the Islamic culture. Right now, about 15% of the Russian population are Muslims, and this share keeps growing, first of all, due to immigration. But still, if immigration is that important for Russia, and if immigration is becoming important for other parts of the world, whose experience can it use? And generally, there are 6 types of countries that have relevant experience, and it is relevant not only to Russia, but to the US as well. First, these are countries of traditional immigration. The US is part of this group, a number of other Anglo-Saxon culturally based countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, but also Israel. Second group is very interesting, and is probably the closest one. These are the former imperial formations, European-based empires that have built huge colonial, structures. And these are, of course, the UK, France, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands. But the most important for Russia specifically are other 3: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and especially Turkey. These were territorially contiguous empires. And when they started falling apart, they started a large-scale movement, migration movement, very similar to what was going on in Russia in the previous 25 years. First, these were representatives of the metropoles. So the Brits, the French, the Dutch, who were returning in large numbers to their, homelands. And then this wave that was politically motivated was followed by a new wave. People who were citizens now of colonies, nationals of colonies, that were going after economic, first of all, opportunities. And this migration was very frequently illegal. It was very frequently temporary, at least initially. And, Arabs were going, for example, to France, while people from the Caribbean and South Asia were going to Britain, from Indonesia to the Netherlands, and so on and so forth. And the problems that are faced by major Western European countries in this sense are pretty close to the Russian ones. Next group Well, countries of Southern, Central, Eastern Europe, Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal, but also former communist states that first have drastically changed their position in the world migration chain. For generations, they were source countries of migration, so people were leaving them. And then in literally, 10, 15 years, they have become the major receiving countries and also, transit countries. And they had to build a new, immigration structures and formulate immigration policies. And right now, for example, they are facing this refugee flow coming from countries of, the Middle East and North Africa, the so-called MENA countries. Next group, countries that have experienced large elite emigration in previous years. China, Japan, South Korea, India, and a number of others. They have lost significant segments of their elites. And at present, they work hard in order to either bring these people back or at least establish working relationships with them. For example, if we talk about China, after its opening up to the West in the 1970s, 2.6 million Chinese students went to study in Western universities. Returned 1.1 million, that means 1.5 million stayed in the West. So the Chinese are very actively working with this group. In case of India, the situation is similar, especially in the fields of high tech, medical industry. And the Indians, for example, have introduced the overseas citizenship of India for such people, and again work with them hard. Next group is very interesting, and it reminds us that the situation in the US, in Western Europe, in Russia is far from being the worst. Well, these are countries that have experienced an explosive economic growth in the previous, 20, 30, 40 years. And they had to bring large numbers of immigrants. These are countries of the Gulf, some countries in Southeast Asia, some smaller states even in Europe. And just as an example, the share of immigrants in the population of United Arab Emirates is 84%, Qatar 74%, Kuwait 60%, Bahrain 55%. Basically, considering the policies of those countries that make it practically impossible to get their citizenship and to even obtain a permanent legal status, these countries are becoming time bombs with a very high potential for the implosion as a result of a deep clash between the local population and the discriminated against and ethnically, religiously, culturally different immigrants. And the most important in that area is, of course, the Sunni-Shiite divide. But there are also countries like Singapore, like Hong Kong, and some others that face similar problems. And finally, when we talk about immigration, we shouldn't forget about countries like South Korea, Japan, and some others. They were deliberately blocking immigration and naturalization because they wanted to retain, ethnic, religious, racial purity. And the result right now is that this policy, combined with the declining natural growth rates, have created a situation when social security systems do not get adequate financial support from the population that gets older, and there is no physical ability to provide this support through nursing and other services to their population. So they are changing their policies right now hesitantly, but basically they realize that there is no way out. And ironically, falling into this category is also China with its giant population. The one-child policy has resulted in a tremendous demographic gap, whereas soon there wouldn't be enough people to provide support, either financial or physical, to the older population groups. and China has just modified its single-child policy to two-children policy, and de facto it already faces large-scale illegal immigration from countries like India, but soon probably it will become a country of immigration and will have to compete with other countries for migrants, and not only highly qualified ones. That's an area. Well, if there are these various types of countries of immigration, various challenges within immigration domain, what can the US, not only Russia, but also the US, borrow or learn from other countries? Well, let's look at what is going on in Europe. After World War II, Europeans have opened two channels of immigration. First, they needed large numbers of, well, labor migrants. And they started to bring people, well, former colonial powers from their former colonies, in Germany, primarily from Turkey, then moving to the Balkans. This policy continued roughly until 1974, when Europeans started to shut down the doors overall to, well, external immigration. Second, well, aspect of European immigration policy was very lax, well, refugee legislation. It was oriented primarily towards the people from the communist countries, although was creating a loophole for people from other regions. And again, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the end of the Cold War, well, Europeans immediately have lost most of their interest in refugee problem and started to view them de facto, of course, behind the closed doors, as a nuisance, as well, a social problem rather than a political and moral obligation. Well, there were two processes developing in Europe that were going simultaneously, but in just the opposite directions. With the creation of the Schengen zone and a number of other legislative initiatives, Europeans have created two migration regimes. First, Europe without borders, opening up the doors for movement of EU's citizens and legal residents without any hindrance. They can move, they can settle in any EU member state, they can take any type of job, including many, well, governmental jobs, with the exception of those related to security. You can become a clerk, you cannot become a police officer, for example. And simultaneously, they started to build Fortress Europe. It became harder and harder to enter, well, the EU space for people from outside the EU, especially from the developing countries. And, these policies combined, so economic immigration until 1974, well, refugee migration until 1989, and developing right now competition for, well, highly qualified workers, has created a situation when there are 34.3 million, non-European citizens, people who were not born in the EU member states, that means technical immigrants, living within the EU. It's 6.8% of the overall population. Among them are 19.8 million people who are not citizens of the EU. It's 3.9% of the population. So about a half of immigrants have been naturalized. They have got European citizenship, well, EU member state citizenship to be exact, but about a half are retaining their immigrant status. Well, if we talk about Germany, 7.5 million non-nationals living there. The UK, 5.4 million. Italy, 5 million. Spain, 4.5 million. France, 4.4 million. Overall, these five countries account for 76% of all non-nationals, non-EU nationals living within the European Union. But these figures are much higher in countries affiliated with the EU but not members. Switzerland, 27.4%. Liechtenstein, 63.7%. Again, situation similar, for example, to the Gulf. Well, with the growth of nationalist parties that essentially pursue two goals. First, limiting the power of EU bureaucratic institutions, and second, well, limiting immigration. Formed were these very parties. We should specifically mention right now Alternative for Germany in Germany, the Pegida movement also in Germany, National Front in France, the United Kingdom Independence Party in Britain, and numerous others. With the growth of anti-immigrant movements at the grassroots level, both the existing governments and these movements started to pressure for the tightening of immigration policies. The previous, president of France, who can come back yet to power next year, Nicolas Sarkozy, who, by the way, himself is an, descendant of immigrants. He is, a descendant of Hungarian Jews. He has stated that Europeans right now, specifically, and the world in general, are facing two types of immigration. The chosen one, so highly skilled, immigration, and the suffered one. And essentially, we see this trend worldwide. There is an increasing competition for highly skilled migrants, and simultaneously the growing resistance to other groups of migrants. Other terms that are used in the same regard are unwanted for suffered and wanted for chosen. The unwanted ones are also divided into two groups. The inevitable, irregular migrants whom nobody lets in, but they get there on their own, and the accepted but not welcomed. And this includes, first of all, family reunification and asylum seekers. On average in Europe, the share of migrants who come through family reunification channels is between 40 and 60%, reaching 70% in France. And the Europeans for a long time have pursued the policy of multiculturalism. Basically, they have said, you know what, we welcome you, and we do not force you to get assimilated. Get integrated if you want, but we don't force you to change your culture, to change your language, to change your traditions. Under the conditions when immigrants were channeled to settle in separate settlements, say suburbs of Paris, for example, it has created a situation when they had to go to schools, while teaching their language. They had no interaction with the locals. The gap continued to grow, and basically with the second generation, another class was created that could not get integrated even when it wanted to. It simply did not have adequate skills, language, cultural adjustment to leave these settlements. The result, as you know, was a series of explosions of anger, first of all in France, in the Netherlands, in Austria. At present, the situation is further worsened by terrorist acts, psychological association that is played by the media, by the politicians between migrants and these phenomena. Essentially, we can talk about three major factors that right now turn the population against immigrants. Socioeconomic, struggle in the labor market, competition in the labor market, at least the alleged one, Second, pressure on well, social welfare mechanisms. Well, security related that I have just mentioned, and the fear of loss of cultural authenticity. In regard to emigration, the biggest fear, as I have mentioned already, is the fear of the loss of young, ambitious, members of the elite, and the fear of the demographic consequences of the loss of the younger generation. In general, everything that we have said up to this point concerned Russia, Western Europe, to some extent the United States. But the irony is that the last factor, the fear of the loss of various elites, is especially significant for the global South. And just as an illustration, well, the number of innovators coming to the United States is 15 times higher than the number of those leaving the United States. So there's a tremendous asymmetry, and that causes apprehension and anger on the part of many governments and many countries in general. Out of roughly 3.6 million international students, 670 go to schools in the United States, and well, most of them pay tuition, financing, and not only bringing their brains, but also financing well, education and research in many global North countries. So all this is important and not very pleasant in this sense. How much time do I have? Is it until 3:50?
You've got a little bit more time.
Mm-hmm.
You might leave a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, then just literally about 5 minutes about the United States. So with well, the emergence of Trump, the immigration issues that were already pretty hot came to the forefront. What is interesting is that population, the electorate, did not consider immigration to be the most important issue. Trump is not the first one to try to bring this issue. Well, it started with Buchanan, then a number of other politicians, but nobody before him had a success. Just a couple of words about the scale of the problem and the major outlines. Well, remember I said Russia right now has 12.3 million immigrants. It is the second largest country of immigration in the world, ironically. It has surpassed Germany. In the United States, the number of immigrants, people who were not born in the US, right now is 42.4 million. Of those, as you know, well, 11.4 roughly are the illegal immigrants, keeping in mind what I said before about this term. Living in the families of illegal immigrants are 4.2 million children born in the United States and thus constitutionally being US citizens. All this creates very serious complications. While the majority of immigrants still came from Latin America, and say among the illegals, 71% came from Mexico and Central America. The share of Latin Americans in immigration is quickly declining. And right now, well, coming to the forefront is immigration from, well, China, India, the Philippines, and a number of other countries. So trends are obviously changing. What irritates, say, the Republicans and, well, creates kind of political fears in this area is the tremendous growth of the Hispanic population. In the year 1900, there were 500,000 Hispanics living in the United States. The current figure is 55 million. So it's a tremendous growth. And their share in the electorate already exceeds 10% and continues to grow. So the Republicans were working pretty consistently while the Republican elites, ignoring the pressure from many of their activist groups to increase the support of Hispanic electorate. George Bush has got 41% of Hispanic vote. Well, then there was a decline. McCain got 23. McCain got 27, Romney 23. There were expectations that Jeb Bush, for the first time, could get a half. Well, as you know, all cards were kind of mixed. And here comes the irony of Trump. He consolidated the white vote. He pushed away Hispanic vote and the vote by a number of other majorities. Well, what is interesting, for a very long time, American immigration policy did not have a clear ethnic component or, in general, effective strategy. Initially, immigration was dominated by people coming from Northern and Western Europe. The share of the others was minuscule, but even at that time, there were some apprehensions expressed. What do you think if I ask you, what group was the first one to be mentioned as dangerous for the ethnic purity of the United States population? Ethnic, cultural, racial? Just guess. Nobody mentioned Russians. Nobody yet even mentioned Catholics. Germans, and it was mentioned by nobody but Benjamin Franklin, who wrote once that, well, we should ban German immigration. Germans are too dumb to learn English or, understand, our culture. He probably meant people like Amish, but it sounds very impressive still. And the first openly immigrant yet movements, not even policies, started with the arrival now, yes, of Catholics from Southern Europe, Italians first of all, and from Ireland. And there was discrimination, there was, movements were formed. But the first legislative act in this area that really has been openly discriminatory was the Act on Chinese Exclusion in 1880 that has banned Chinese immigration for 10 years and has banned naturalization of Chinese permanent residents of the United States. But overall, until roughly 1920s, the policy was not clearly defined, articulated. And then when the share of immigrants in the US population has reached 14.5% around 1920, quotas were introduced. And by the way, obvious public reaction, political reaction to the changing role of immigrants in society. 14.5%. Right now, it is above 13%, so it's coming close, even though it is still lower than that. And, openly discriminatory quotas were introduced that were linking quotas for a particular region to the share of this region in the US population. All this lasted until 1965, when in the framework of a general liberalization, human rights campaign, all this was eliminated, and the emphasis was made on bringing highly qualified specialists and family reunification. As a result, immigration policy within a very short period of time has reversed itself. Before 1965, 90% of immigrants were coming from Europe, and then just 10% started to be coming from Europe. Step by step, this policy started to cause, apprehensions, irritations. And the last thing I will mention, because it's interesting, is that as a reaction to the growing share of illegals in the population, in 1986, ironically, Ronald Reagan has signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act that has introduced for the first time punishment to employers for hiring illegal immigrants, and has introduced amnesty 2.7 million out of 6 million illegals that were in the US at that time were legalized. It's kind of ironic because the only immigration amnesty introduced in the United States and signed into the law was signed by Ronald Reagan. Right now, when you tell it to, say, the conservatives, they're not happy about that. Well, unfortunately, I don't have already time for any kind of conclusions, but hopefully I can still answer some of your questions, if you have any.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, it's just since there were no other questions, I thought about what are your thoughts on Hungary closing their borders to receive migrants?
Well, it's not only about immigrants. It's about the relationship between national states in Europe and the EU institutions. It's to a large extent a populist measure, but it will be followed by similar measures in other European countries, and it allows for grandstanding of the Hungarian government. So they will continue these policies, and the more the EU pressures them, the more popular this government will become in Hungary. So we're facing, well, a period of political populism. We see it in the US, we see it in Europe, but whatever happens in November, it is clear that populist parties will win in a number of European countries. The government of Orban, Viktor Orban in Hungary, is already pursuing this policy, and he gains points pursuing this policy. And that means that he will continue on the same road, and others will try to do the same. And two trends have combined: a tremendous irritation linked to the fact that the EU takes more and more functions from national governments, and the fear. It's not only socioeconomic, it's not only security issue, it's the fear of the loss of, identity, ethnic, cultural, religious. So I unfortunately can guarantee that it will get worse. Ira?
There is a certain tendency for retirees from the United States or in the United States moving down south to Latin America. How significant is the tendency, and is it considered to be immigration?
Yes, it is immigration. Any long-term move to another country would be considered an immigration. It can be temporary, it can be permanent. But it is immigration, and there are about 2 million such retirees living in Latin America right now from the United States. How will it evolve? It's hard to say, because if there is a growth of populism in the US, there will be a response in those countries, inevitably. And if it is so, the atmosphere might become much less welcoming to such people. So we'll see. Anything that happens on the international arena is based, both legally and practically, on reciprocity. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. You put a knife in my back, well, good for you. Okay.
Other questions?
Hopefully I didn't scare you off or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.